Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel, as mentioned, which is about the future of VC platforms. I am Irwin-Hunt. I'll be moderating this session, and as mentioned, I am a global markets editor at FDI Intelligence, a specialist publication at the Financial Times focused on foreign investment. Before I introduce our fantastic two panelists, I think it's worth setting the scene. Clearly, the coronavirus pandemic has posed a whole host of challenges to our societies, economies, and our daily lives. And startups, scale-ups, and their surrounding entrepreneurial communities have not been unscathed in the disruption that's come alongside this global pandemic. And indeed, investors have been and will continue to be key to providing assistance to startups during this crisis and beyond, through both the capital and expertise that they are providing them, but also through leveraging their platforms to help build resilience. And indeed, this is what our panel will be discussing. So what exactly are VC platforms? How can they be used to improve the prospects for both investors and their portfolio companies? And most importantly, how will they develop into the future? So to answer these very pertinent questions, I'm very glad to be joined by Jimmy Fusing Nielsen, who is a co-founder of Heartcore Capital, a pan-European early-stage consumer-focused VC, which has offices in Copenhagen, Berlin, and Paris. Thank you for joining me, Jimmy. And I'm equally glad to be joined by Anton Norrman, an associate at Kinnevik, as many of you will know, is a listed Swedish investment company that invests in startups at a variety of different stages. So thank you both for joining me. I think before we start to get into the depths of the discussion, what's the future going to be? What exactly is a VC platform? Jimmy, maybe you can start us off. What is a VC platform and how can investors leverage them to their advantage?
Thanks a lot, Alex. I don't think I have I tried to Google it, but I couldn't find an answer, but let's try it. So basically a VC platform is definitely more than a few guys doing investments in single companies, right? So that used to be, in infancy of venture capital, that probably used to be the norm. But today we are trying to more institutionalize how we operate in various ways, right? In order for us to make sure that the learnings we get from one company or several companies shared among a lot of companies very fast, right? And maybe also between co-investors and so forth, right? So it's a more structured approach. It's not a band of brothers. That might not be gender friendly to say that, but in our industry, it's still a lot of gentlemen. Whereas today, it's really larger structures, right? So it's kind of if you think about it from a networking perspective, instead of being a one-to-one or a one-to-many, it's probably going to be more of a many-to-many kind of setup, right? Where we're trying to leverage best practices and share learnings and so on. And right now in this pandemic, of course, that has been acutely important to share that learnings very, very fast, actually, on various occasions, right? From how to operate, how to fundraise, how to get government programs working and so forth.
Indeed. And would you agree, Anton, is it more about taking a structured, institutionalized approach, or was there anything you perhaps would add to this nebulous definition of VC platforms?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with Jimmy's way of positioning it. I definitely think it's about institutionalizing and to some extent packaging the common knowledge and networks that you have at your firm. And I think it's done both to position yourselves as an investor towards investees and but also to hopefully create some value at the end of the day, right? Because I think positioning and communicating how you're different and what you do that others don't is one thing, but if you can't deliver on those promises, then everyone will know. So I think it's to me it's both sides of that coin.
Definitely, I agree. I'd like to remind the audience, we want to have you engage in this discussion. So if you'd like to pose any questions, please keep them coming in the Brella platform, and I'll allocate some time at the end of this discussion for them. But before then we go into the future, we need to perhaps talk about the present, the current state of play of VC platforms. Jimmy, I'll come back over to you. I mean, we discussed previously in our preparatory call, what the changing landscape of venture capital across Europe. Can you give us maybe a brief overview of how VC has changed and what this means in practice for VC platforms?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, there has been a lot of more players coming into the market. Luckily also for the founder side, of course, that there's more choice. and you can see that both in the amount of capital being deployed and raised, but you can also see it in the investment activity, right? So basically what we have seen, I would say in the last 5-7 years, is a maturing of the European ecosystem. And with that, we have seen also a lot of specialization coming around. Whether that's early or late stage. In the old days, it was mostly regional and mostly early stage, right? And then you have seen, early stage, late stage growth. You have seen emerging managers. You have seen different formats on the very early stage, from acceleration to incubation to angel structured setups and angel lists and what have you, right? So I think we're just seeing a maturing and specializing environment and gone from sort of very regional focus to sort of a more pan-European, maybe even broader geo footprint.
Indeed. And I suppose in light of this specialization landscape, I'd like to come over to you, Anton. What do you think is the best approach for VC platforms then to differentiate themselves from peers as there's this increased specialization?
I think you could do that in several ways, and I don't think there's a one answer that will be the right one for everyone. I think you need to find an approach or define an approach that makes sense to you and your firm and your strategy and your investment horizon. So Kinnevik, for instance, we're an evergreen investors. We invest off our own balance sheet, which means that we can be long-term in our engagements, and we obviously try to define our platform and our platform strategy whilst keeping that in the back of our minds. So we want to create something that will create value for founders over time and perhaps even increasingly so over time. So we've for instance just hired a chief person and platform officer to do just that, to kind of set the framework for us and how to position it and how to really create that value. Because I think with the capital inflow in the market, and there's frankly an abundance of it, you need to find different ways to differentiate, and the platform is one such way, but I think you need to be stringent in how you do it.
Indeed.
If I may add, Alex,
please.
Can I just add to this one, because I think there's also a little bit, it seems to me at least, there's a little bit of a religious discussion here in this particular choice of how to develop platforms, right? And I think you have a lot of approaches, but you have two that are sort of generic. You have one that's kind of centralizing functional value add and being a full service provider, kind of. I think that's usually very large investment institutions. And then you have the approach of more, I would say, decentralized or more community management approach, right? Where instead of being the central node in the network, you enable the network or the community, right? And I think the jury is out what is the most efficient, but I think you see those two things that are really happening. And then one final thing on that, right? I think there's a lot of things we are doing, both decentralized and centralized, on a lot of the functional value add. But there's still a lot of things that are not really discussed on the more emotional value add, because in the last 6 months, for instance, right, most difficult discussions for founders and so on have been, how do I manage my cash flow? And we all know what that means, right? That probably means that you have to put people on furlough, you have to reduce your staff, and many of the younger founders hadn't done it before, right? And had to stop and hold and do that. And how do you lead through that? How do you lead through running from home, right? Working from home and you can't really feel it out, right? But that's how do you go that, and how do the leaders themselves react to this situation, right? And effectively lead at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. Please go on, Anton, if you had a...
Yeah, if I can just add to that kind of light touch versus high touch approach, and what COVID tells us about where to position oneself on that scale. I think being there reactively when something happens is one thing that everyone should do. But I think we can all learn to be a bit more proactive in taking responsibility for our investees and our founders, because there are bad examples out there of companies that didn't really think about future proofing, if you will, and it had catastrophic consequences. So I think COVID can tell us that we need to be a bit more proactive in how we manage.
Indeed, I think proactivity is key in terms of building resilience, which of course is the theme of this overall conference. So I suppose then, Jimmy, I'm going to come back to you and please respond accordingly if you see fit, Anton. But investors using their platforms to build resilience in their portfolio companies, startups, and sort of any resilience in general in the surrounding communities. What do you think some of the best approaches are to do that, to build resilience?
In the last 6 months, building resilience is starting with the cash flow management, to be honest, right? And maybe that's dull and just what an investor would like to say. But the reality is that most of our companies are not cash flow break-even companies, right? They are indeed cash burning companies on a growth path. And there, I think the discipline, especially March, April, was really getting an overview as an investor, right, in the portfolio, but also with management team explore what is really possible and feasible, also individually in the companies, and make sure that is that was really what March, I would say, that was what March and April was all about mostly. And then now it shows how difficult that was, because I think there was a lot of overshooting in some places and in other places undershooting, right? So it's not something where, this is also where we as VCs have to be extremely careful of trying to go in and say, this is what we learned in this particular company, and now we need to apply that to your company as well, right? And how would that work, right? But trying to predict how market develops and customer audiences develop in specific areas is I mean, obviously Zoom is an easy prediction, but other things have not been easy, right? We have one company, a German company selling solar panels and so on, which is a large price point type of investment for a consumer, 15,000, 20,000 euros. We would think that German recession and so on will go down. And the only reason that we saw reduction is that we didn't have a lot of salespeople and marketing people, because they weren't furloughed, right? I mean, self-inflicted, right? And actually more than ever, it's growing, right? So it's difficult to centralize also sometimes this sharing of learnings and best practices.
Yeah. I wonder, Anton, do you have any other tangible examples that would illustrate the point of how you can build resilience and maybe where it's worked and not worked in using your platform in that way?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Jimmy that cash flow management is probably the way COVID accentuated itself to us in the VC world. But I think the way I think one lesson that we try to learn is basically that we need to early on, basically from due diligence, we need to have a view on not only the founders but the company in a broader sense, even if it's a very early stage company, because if the founders and the team need to adhere to the same principles as you do, they need to be believers in the principles that you're a believer in, and there need to be certain kind of policies and procedures in place for them to be well equipped to handle a crisis, humanitarian, financial, whatever. But I think we can learn that you need to be from a very early stage and probably already from the diligence. You need to have an idea of where the company is on that maturity curve, and then work with the company, which is something we try to do. We have a dedicated GRC director who's tasked with building sustainable long-term businesses out of our companies, and a lot of the times that comes down to helping them put policies and procedures in place, which doesn't sound like the most value creating activity you can do, but it's proven to be very depictive of who's well placed to kind of navigate a crisis, which we've seen now over the last 6 months.
Yeah, just to add there, I think the biggest ask that we have seen, I feel, across the board now, is the ask about leadership in the current environment, right? It used to be cash management. How do we fundraise? How do we secure? And maybe also partly dictated by the VCs that saw the writing on the wall. But I think now it's coming back to leadership issues, and there's a kind of conundrum, right? The people out there in the market of companies that have been the hardest hit have actually, in my opinion, been probably the fastest learners of how to manage leadership in the current situation, whereas the people that haven't really been hit so hard has also not learned so fast, if that kind of makes sense. So I think that is a question that I think we'll see a lot more on how to do that, and when in most cases half of the workforce is still not in the office or more, depending on your territory. That's really difficult.
Yeah, indeed.
And of course, they should all use Pecan to help them. But that's another thing.
Yeah, of course, indeed. I suppose I'm actually going to come to one of the audience questions now, because I think it's a relevant question to ask as we discuss the emotional elements, as you mentioned, Jimmy, and how leadership is very important. And of course, this whole discussion about platforms is really what VCs can give and provide startups beyond just the capital. And I suppose in that regard, if leadership is the leading issue, really, or thing to make sure that you shore up to get through a crisis such as this, what can VCs offer startups in terms of leadership? Maybe Anton, you can touch on it, and we can come back to Jimmy on this one.
Sure, and I think again, I think there are different ways to do it, but for young entrepreneurs, it's about getting into that network and finding mentors and people who've been in their situation that can act as trusted advisors, which in a lot of cases a VC partner can, but there may be situations where you want someone on slightly on the outside, and we can definitely provide them that. It can be about knowledge sharing through workshops, etc., training. So there I think there's a lot you can do. It's more at the end of the day, it has to be based on the need from the founder and the team. So I think we tend to adapt based on the individual and the need that they have.
I suppose that maybe I can rephrase the question, because we are all, of course, at this conference virtually, and perhaps the workshops, the collaboration, the knowledge sharing can be done both virtually and physically. Do you think there's any impediments to what VC platforms can do, given that we are in a virtual environment, or perhaps it's a positive? It's easier to connect with GPs. It's easier to connect with the decision makers, perhaps, and with people with past experience. What's your take on VC platforms in this virtual environment we find ourselves in?
I think for the functional value add, I think it's more efficient, frankly. For the emotional value add, I don't think it's more efficient at all. It's super hard to understand the inner workings of how you think about a certain delicate issue when we're sitting and having coffee over Zoom. So I think that's where the biggest issues are right now, I think. And I think it's, as a VC, what we can help with and what we should help with, and that's why we are called Heartcore, right? We think that the emotional value add is probably something that's more important than what people normally would think. And there, first of all, I would be humble and say, I don't think VCs or GPs and VCs in general are the best leaders in the world. And I think it's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy when you run a small company rather than a large. But I think what you can do, you can build a relationship of trust where founders are allowed to, show the dirty underwear, right? And say, I have these issues. And also still the other side is accepting that for a fact and not only taking the rosy picture, right? Or the good numbers or whatever. Let's talk about the real problems, right? And your real concerns, and let's try to together figure out, is that something where from a leadership perspective you need a mentor or coach, or is it others where we can bring in other people in the board, or is it in the company and so on. But only if we talk about the real issues that are often emotionally, how can we then unlock and try to help solve them, right? And that's kind of that trust relationship I think that needs to be in order for that to unlock. And that is something that built over time. It's something that's earned. It's not there upfront. And that's harder when you don't have social interaction.
Indeed, I think trustworthy, open, candid conversations are what needed, and particularly in disruptive times such as these. I see where our time is quickly running out, so I want to make sure I touch on green innovation. Of course, if we're talking about the future of VC platforms, they should be enabling the green future that we're all hoping for and striving towards. So Anton, I'll come to you on this. How can VC platforms be used to further or foster green innovation? And maybe are there any salient examples that you would use to highlight that point?
Yeah, I think historically it's been that type of change takes time, and that's been a challenge for let's call them traditional VC funds. I think everyone needs to realize that all investments that will be super successful over time needs to be mindful of the environment and our impact. I don't think you'll necessarily be very successful by just neglecting that point, and that doesn't matter if you're in e-commerce or fintech or what have you. I think you need to position yourself on that spectrum. But I think for specific green investments, it's obviously been a challenge since they often come with kind of front-loaded capex needs, and for traditional VC that's been challenging. For us, it's been challenging for different reasons. But we could, in theory, take that long-term bet and be part of that journey. Due to our kind of structure and our capital.
Indeed, and I think, Jimmy, you have a point to make in this regard, the difference between evergreen model investing off the balance sheet versus the 10-year plus 2 typical VC model. What's your take on this?
Well, I think that's a little bit nerdy GP kind of discussion here, perhaps, right? But I think that the reality is that most 10 plus 2 type of GP LP structures, not Anton, but the rest of us, that type of structure is very good for software investing. But I think that might not be so good for a cell-based meat type of investments, because they might take a little bit longer time to mature and become real companies. They might not be very good vehicles for high capex, high intense, front-loaded costs, right? So I think we might want to think about new setups, investment companies, evergreens, dedicated structures, or longer-term structures, and not the usual, mostly software-based type of innovation. So it will work for some. There's a lot of software assistance also in the green innovation, of course, but there will be some other things that are not catering so much to that type of platform setup.
Indeed. Unfortunately, as ever with these discussions, we could have another 3 hours on this, but I'm going to make sure I get over to a few of the audience questions. And this is a particularly interesting question. Will VCs in the future be hiring more technically minded people to enable more data-driven approach? a more data-driven approach. Anton, maybe you can touch on that briefly, and then we'll come back to Jimmy.
Yeah, sure. I think the answer, the short answer is yes. I think nuancing that a bit, I think it's a question of time and when you're ready for that and when you think it makes sense. I think most of us invest in technology, and I think for you need to have people who understands technology on a very deep level to be truly relevant. And you can do that either through hiring someone in-house or building up networks with trusted advisors to help you with that. But I definitely think the industry is going in that direction, and as time passes, I'm convinced that a lot of firms will hire someone with that skill set and that capacity.
I think the question might be if we are hiring software engineers to help building part of the platform, and I think they are probably the answer is probably yes. I think, of course, most tech VCs are quite tech-minded in the first place, and we are definitely data-driven. But I think you would see more engineers coming in also for some of the platform things, both on the marketing front, but also on the sourcing front and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Unfortunately, as we close up very soon on our time, I want to just perhaps have some key takeaways for the audience. And we've mentioned a lot of the learnings you've had over the last 6 months of this disruptive period. I suppose, what have you learned in the last 6 months that you think may shape the future of VC platforms? Anton, very quickly, a quick note, and then Jimmy, last note, and we'll close up.
Yeah, sure. I've learned that I think it's fair to say that the world is not going to end, and it's all a bit more resilient than maybe we thought, but that we need to be proactive in how we work with the founders in order to build businesses that are sustainable in the long term. Indeed.
And Jimmy, last point from you.
Yeah, since we're wrapping up, I think the main thing that I've learned is that we now need to operate under uncertainty and not only under risk. Mm-hmm. That's probably the biggest difference, and that is a slightly different, more difficult situation to be in.
So proactivity in an uncertain world, not just risk. Thank you very much all for listening. Wish we had more time to discuss, but this is certainly going to be an evolving debate as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.